Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. On quiet evenings across America, living rooms flickered with images of rice paddies, tracer rounds, and burning villages. Television screens cast harsh light across tired faces, revealing a war too distant to touch, yet too vivid to ignore. News anchors spoke in somber tones, stitching jungles and jungles into suburbs and small towns. For the first time, combat was not described, it was witnessed. Parents watched soldiers younger than their own children slog through mud beneath a sky humming with helicopter blades. Broadcasters shifted from medals and speeches to footage of medics kneeling beside wounded men. The war's weight began to settle across kitchen tables sandwiched between coffee cups and unpaid bills. Every newscast eroded the certainty that the United States knew exactly what it was doing. Politicians measured success in territory and slogans, but cameras measured failure in screams and smoke. Public trust faltered as official optimism clashed with the sorrow pouring nightly into the American home. The gap between what was said and what was seen widened into something unspoken and cold. It seeped into conversations, elections, and dreams. And yet beneath all of this noise, a question lingered like static on the screen. How did a global superpower find itself bleeding into the background of its own television sets? The answer did not begin with gunfire. It began decades earlier in colonies carved by foreign hands, where nationalism simmered like an ember waiting for oxygen. As the television glow faded each night, the war's shadow stretched farther across the walls of American memory, hinting that the battlefield would never truly stay overseas. Long before American boots pressed into Vietnamese mud, another flag flew over the paddies. For nearly a century, France ruled Indochina with a rigid fist carving plantations from fertile hillsides and taxing rice so heavily that hunger became a familiar shadow. Vietnamese farmers bent their backs beneath foreign landlords who spoke of civilization but delivered only extraction. Out of resentment and humiliation, a quiet resistance took shape. Into this world stepped a wiry young radical named Nguyen Tat Thanh, who would later call himself Ho Chi Minh. He traveled the globe, Boston dockyards, Paris cafes, Moscow, lecture halls, absorbing ideas like a sponge. Everywhere he looked, he saw one pattern repeating: small nations ruled by distant empires, their identities suppressed beneath imported laws and languages. When he returned home, his voice carried not only struggle, but purpose. Independence was no longer a dream, it was a doctrine. World War II shattered the old order. Japan seized control, stripping rice from the Vietnamese to feed their armies, leaving famine in their wake. Villagers whispered that the fields themselves were turning against them. As Tokyo's empire collapsed, Ho Chi Minh seized the microphone in Hanoi. Beneath ragged flags and jubilant citizens, he declared Vietnam free. For a heartbeat, the air tasted like destiny. France, bruised by the war, but unwilling to surrender its empire, returned with rifles and pride. The Vietnamese fought from caves and jungles, striking and vanishing like water through fingers. At Dien Bien Phu, artillery thundered from hills. French officers thought impossible to climb. When smoke cleared, France's resolve crumbled. The empire wilted on the battlefield, and negotiators met in Geneva to draw lines across maps. Vietnam was split, north under Ho Chi Minh, south under Ngo Dinh Diem. A temporary measure, they promised, but divisions rarely remain temporary. Families were divided by politics, faith, and fear. Soldiers patrolled borders that had never existed before. The war's roots wound deeper, nourished by wounded pride and competing visions. As global powers watched, each saw something of themselves reflected in Vietnam's struggle. For Washington, the line was clear: if communism spread here, where would it stop? Yet in the villages, old grievances mattered more than ideologies drafted in faraway capitals. While leaders debated dominoes and doctrines, farmers simply wanted their land back. The soil beneath Vietnam's feet had long been soaked with foreign ambition. And as the Cold War's frost crept across the map, those roots hardened, preparing the stage for the next empire, convinced it could shape this land to its will. In the newborn state of South Vietnam, Washington found a man it hoped could hold the line: Ngo Dinh Diem. A devout Catholic in a mostly Buddhist land, stern and disciplined, he spoke the language of anti-communism with conviction. To American officials, he looked like stability in human form. To many villagers, he looked like someone appointed, not chosen. Still, U.S. advisors poured in convinced they could shape a nation from conferences and blueprints. Diem governed with a tight fist. He distrusted rivals, dismissed critics, and filled key posts with loyal family members. His brother Ngo Dinh Nhu ran secret police units that slipped into alleys at night. Rumors spread that dissent could vanish without echo. In villages, corruption clung to officials like dust permits, required bribes, graft skimmed from land programs, and rice taxes stacked heavier on the poor. Beneath official reports of progress, resentment pulsed like a fever. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the Viet Cong Southern Communists backed by Hanoi moved like whispers. They offered solutions the government never did resolve: land disputes, punish abusive landlords, protect harvests. Their promises were simple and tangible. Diem's policies, drafted in urban offices, rarely reached the paddies where hearts were won or lost. Villagers weighed both choices carefully. In the silence of night, many chose not out of ideology, but survival. American advisors urged reforms, warning that repression would fuel rebellion. Diem waved them off, convinced that opposition was treason, that fear could shape loyalty. Protests grew first small, then loud. Monks climbed onto street corners and lit their robes aflame flames, reflected in the bewildered eyes of bystanders. Television cameras blinked, capturing the inferno. Images of burning flesh reached U.S. living rooms faster than speeches could explain them. Washington's confidence wavered. A quiet decision took shape in embassy hallways: Diem was becoming a liability. In 1963, South Vietnamese generals received a wink of permission. Tanks rolled through Saigon, gunfire echoed down boulevards, and Diem's reign ended in the back of an armored vehicle. The United States had helped remove the leader it once promised to protect. But power without legitimacy is like scaffolding without stone. New generals took office, each promising order, each lasting only months. Alliances fractured, promotions were traded like favors, and villages watched leaders rotating like seasons. The government's weakness spread beyond the cities, bleeding into farmland and foothills. And in the tall grass beyond the highway, the Viet Cong listened. Chaos was not their enemy, it was their ally. After Diem's fall, Washington faced a choice it had never wanted to make in daylight. Advisors whispered that without firm support, South Vietnam could collapse within months. Yet sending more Americans into the jungles of a far-off country was a gamble few voters understood. Presidents spoke in measured tones about dominoes nations that might topple into communism if Vietnam fell first. The metaphor became a mantra: simple, frightening, effective. In smoky briefing rooms, generals unrolled maps across polished tables. Arrows marked enemy positions, supply routes, and villages colored red or white like pieces on a chessboard. Charts promised victory if only enough resources were applied. More helicopters, more rifles, more men. Yet the war's logic hid a quiet danger. Every new American added to the fight made withdrawal harder to imagine. By 1964, casualty reports and photographs began trickling back home. Headlines asked whether the U.S. was drifting, not marching into a war. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin, 2 U.S. destroyers, mysterious sonar readings, and radio reports of attacks in the dark. Within days, Congress passed a resolution granting sweeping military authority. Doubts lingered: were the reports accurate, or echoes misread in storm-tossed seas? The vote was overwhelming anyway. Fear was persuasive. American aircraft thundered toward the north, striking bridges, warehouses, and communications hubs. The escalation felt decisive, a show of strength to reassure allies and intimidate enemies. But Hanoi did not flinch. They hardened tunnels, dispersed workshops, and built new routes beneath jungle canopies. Bombs cratered earth. Determination deepened roots. Soon, combat troops arrived first, a few thousand, then tens of thousands. Young men stepped off transport planes into air heavy with humidity and tension. They marched past barbed wire and sandbags, greeted by veterans who already wore the 1,000-yard stare. Politicians called it limited intervention. Soldiers called it war. Helicopters carved their presence across the landscape. From above, villages looked like clusters of clay pots. From below, rotor blades announced every arrival. The U.S. could seize any patch of ground it chose, but holding hearts was another matter entirely. Villagers spoke softly, eyes avoided contact. Loyalty could not be measured on a map. Each strategic review ended the same way, just a little more force, just a little more time. Advisors couched uncertainty in technical vocabulary. Anchors on television repeated phrases that reassured without informing, and the slope steepened. America had tied its credibility to a conflict it barely understood. To lose leaders feared was to prove weakness in every corner of the Cold War. And so, step by hesitant step, the United States walked deeper into the jungle, believing each footfall was reversible. Behind them, the path home was already fading into undergrowth. American commanders arrived with doctrines forged in Europe: mass firepower, clear battle lines, visible supply hubs. They expected an enemy who would meet them in fields wide enough for tanks to maneuver, who would defend capital cities with pride, and stand still long enough to be destroyed. But Vietnam was not Europe, and the Viet Cong were not that kind of enemy. They moved like smoke, never where they were expected, always where they were least wanted. At night they slipped along narrow footpaths guided by memory rather than maps. In daylight they vanished into villages indistinguishable from farmers bending over rice paddies. A man who sold bananas in the morning might carry grenades at dusk. Doubt shadowed every handshake. Fear lived behind every friendly smile. Underground, the earth concealed a labyrinth. Tunnels snaked beneath fields. Workshops buzzed in caverns, and hospitals hid in chambers lit by candles. Attempts to bomb them only pushed the rebels deeper, turning soil into shelter and jungle into fortress. American patrols stumbled upon entrances like trapdoors into another world, low, narrow, suffocating. Down there, the war belonged to someone else. Frustrated U.S. planners shifted strategy. They spoke of body counts as if wars were won by mathematics. Provinces were declared pacified, then flared into violence days later. Helicopters swept over treetops, hurling firepower at shadows and consuming fuel faster than resolve. Villagers saw fields burn, livestock vanish, and homes flattened when commanders suspected collaboration. Each mistake planted new seeds of hatred. Across the border, supply lines stretched down through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Thousands of miles of paths wound like veins through mountains and jungle. Rainstorms, bombs, and hunger could not break them. Men pushed bicycles loaded with rice until spokes warped and frames bent. When trucks failed, bodies replaced engines. Time, not speed, was the currency of the North. Meanwhile, intelligence reports stacked thick on metal desks, full of assumptions, thin on clarity. Charts showed progress because officials demanded progress. Soldiers in the field felt something different. They wrote home about booby traps hidden beneath leaves, about ambushes, erupting from perfect silence, about villages that bowed politely in daylight and fired rifles after sunset. This enemy did not need to win battles. They only needed to make the war last. Every skirmish that ended without resolution was another whisper. We are still here. Every night that fell over jungle and swamp was a reminder that exhaustion can be sharper than any blade. The United States could seize ground. It could burn forests. It could count bodies, but it could never pin down a ghost. Back in the United States, the war arrived without warning. It slipped into living rooms on glowing evening screens carried by anchors with steady voices and eyes that betrayed exhaustion. Grainy footage showed villages burning, helicopters banking through smoke, teenagers firing rifles in rain-soaked jungles. For the first time in American history, the public could watch a war almost as it happened. Mothers recognized the faces of boys no older than their own sons. Fathers watched footage of firefights and wondered if the uniforms looked too familiar. Dinner tables fell quiet. The images were raw, unfiltered, and undeniably real. Politicians in Washington spoke of progress, of tides turning, of victory near at hand. But on television, exhausted soldiers spoke of confusion ambushes and ground loss the moment they moved on. Editors sought balance, but cameras rarely found triumph. They found blood-stained grass burning huts and interviews with men whose voices quivered. One correspondent whispered into his microphone that he could no longer tell where the front line was. The truth was simple and terrifying. There was no front line, just endless jungle and an enemy who faded like mist. This contradiction cracked something deep in the national psyche. It began softly doubts whispered among neighbors' letters, questioning strategy murmurs in college halls. But with each casualty report scrolling across the screen, doubt grew teeth. Students marched under banners, crowds filled city squares, and chants echoed off government buildings. For many, patriotism no longer meant agreement. It meant demanding answers. Draft boards summoned young men by birth date, not by choice. Some watched their numbers appear on television like sentences passed by fate. Parents confronted recruiters, church groups signed petitions, and folk singers strummed guitars in smoky basements weaving protest into melody. America, once proudly united by war, now splintered along generational fault lines. In the White House, advisors measured public opinion with the same urgency as enemy troop movements. Approval ratings became another battlefield, one where perception mattered more than terrain. Officials spoke of strategic hamlets, hampered insurgencies, and narrowed trails. But reporters sweating in jungle humidity filmed ambushes and body bags. When their stories aired, the truth felt sharper than policy. Slowly, trust eroded, not all at once but grain by grain, until the cavern beneath collapsed. The phrase credibility gap took on a weight no memo could soften. A nation began to suspect that behind closed doors the war was going badly. And on the screen, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Parents wrote letters demanding explanations. Students filled draft offices with silence and refusal. Veterans returned home to questions instead of parades. Television could not be shelled, silenced, or censored into optimism. It captured fear, recorded anger, and broadcast doubt. In Vietnam, the soldiers battled an enemy they rarely saw. At home, the government battled an audience it could no longer persuade. In the jungles of Vietnam, the war settled into a grinding rhythm. There were no sweeping offensives, no dramatic maps shifting overnight. Instead, patrols crept forward, ambushes snapped shut, and villages changed hands 3 times in a month. American commanders spoke of progress in numbers. Sorties flown, tons of bombs dropped, enemy dead, tallied like inventory on a ledger. General William Westmoreland believed he could bleed the enemy into submission. Body counts became the language of victory. Officers reported kills with precision, though in the chaos of battle, certainty was rare. Success was measured not by ground held, but by how many enemy bodies lay still at dusk. The strategy sounded clinical in briefings. In the jungle, it was something else entirely. On the ground, soldiers moved through choking humidity and tangled undergrowth. Every rustle might be a trap. Every villager might be an enemy sympathizer. Units swept through hamlets, found nothing, and moved on. Hours later, the Viet Cong returned, whispering promises and warnings in the dark. American firepower could shatter a tree line, but it could not bind loyalty. Helicopters thundered overhead, filling clearings with rotor wash. They carried men to landing zones, extracted them under fire, ferried them from hilltop to hilltop like ghosts. The mobility was unmatched, but it created a strange illusion. Soldiers fought, withdrew, redeployed again tomorrow, never quite knowing what they held. Victory was measured in rotations, not in permanence. For the Vietnamese, time was the sharpest blade. The Viet Cong melted into the countryside, dug deep tunnels, cached rice in hidden pits. They struck when it suited them, and vanished when it didn't. After contact, American patrols found footprints, but never the owners. A firefight, then silence. Anger built. Villages suspected of sheltering the enemy burned beneath napalm's roar. The smoke tasted like defeat. Command posts far from the front demanded results. Charts and graphs filled briefing rooms, arrows pointing upward, lines trending positively. Bombing campaigns expanded. Search and destroy missions intensified. And yet the enemy returned, always returned like bamboo growing back after fire. Attrition worked best against an army that feared death. The Vietnamese had learned to fear surrender more. In the villages, the war was a storm. Peasants dug trenches, hid children beneath bamboo mats, and prayed the fighting would pass. Soldiers handed out candy and daylight suspicion in their eyes. At night, Viet Cong cadres arrived with notebooks and lists asking who cooperated, who refused, who might betray. The war did not visit these villages. It lived in them. American firepower crushed anything it could see. The tragedy was simple. It rarely saw the right things. Platoons stumbled into booby traps rigged from bicycle parts and wires. Soldiers learned to walk with eyes sweeping every branch, every step a test of nerves. A sudden blast, a scream, then the sickening quiet that followed. Morale was measured not by courage, but by endurance. Back in headquarters, Westmoreland's reports painted steady progress, a war nearing its tipping point. But in Hanoi, planners saw something else: momentum built not on territory, but on American exhaustion. They heard the protests across the ocean. They studied the tension on television. They read the casualty reports. To them, every week the war continued was another seed of doubt planted in American soil. Attrition cuts both ways. Bombs shattered villages, but television shattered illusions. The jungle devoured the confidence of commanders who walked its trails only on maps. And still the numbers rose: bodies, bombs, betrayals stacked like sandbags against a flood that could not be stopped by statistics. In the end, the strategy asked one question: who would break first? In Vietnam's forests, patience grew like roots, and the weight of time pressed down on every soldier's shoulders. Beyond the firefights and bombing runs another war unfolded in silence. In government offices, analysts pored over reports from the countryside, counting hamlets, declared pacified, tallying rifles, seized measuring progress in metrics that looked reassuring from behind a desk. Each chart suggested momentum. Each briefing promised a turning point just ahead. But the numbers were illusions stacked carefully on assumptions. A hamlet might be loyal in daylight under American patrols, only to swear allegiance to the Viet Cong when night crept in. Hearts and minds could not be logged like supplies. Loyalty was fluid, shifting beneath fear, survival, and memory of foreign boots on native soil. Advisors urged reforms to counter corruption in the South Vietnamese government. Yet bribes greased bureaucratic gears, and promised aid often evaporated before reaching the villages it was meant to protect. American officials lectured on democracy while propping up leaders whose legitimacy lived only in radio broadcasts and propaganda posters. In the countryside, peasants saw power not as ideals, but as whoever arrived first with a rifle. In Saigon, loyalty was currency. Officers inflated enemy casualty reports to earn promotions. Supplies earmarked for patrols vanished into black markets. The war became an economy of favors and connections where truth was traded cheaply. For soldiers on the ground, frustration knotted inside their chests. They fought and bled, only to learn that victories printed in newspapers were battles they never witnessed. Meanwhile, North Vietnam sharpened its own weapons, propaganda, patience, and infiltration. Cadres slipped through bamboo groves, whispered to farmers about corrupt officials, and rich foreigners steering the country's fate. They spoke of independence, dignity, land. Their promises were simple, their presence relentless. The jungle itself seemed to echo their message. In Washington, political advisors worried less about villages in Vietnam and more about voting districts back home. Speeches softened ugly realities. Phrases like "light at the end of the tunnel" echoed across press rooms, while soldiers slogged through rice paddies that smelled only of mud and fear. The more officials promised progress, the more disbelief simmered. Hope weaponized against itself. The intelligence war spiraled into confusion. Intercepts suggested enemy weakness, but troop movements revealed strength. Captured documents contradicted official briefings. The truth drowned beneath reports tailored to soothe. Analysts feared being labeled pessimists. Generals feared contradicting the president. And so optimism became doctrine enforced not by conviction, but by career survival. Among soldiers, whispers traveled faster than orders. They spoke of objectives, unclear ground gained, and abandoned friends lost in firefights that never made the evening news. Letters home grew shorter, words heavier. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, faces in a crowd, shadows beneath palm leaves, voices fading into dark tunnels. Night patrols revealed the true shape of the war. Flares arced into black skies, illuminating paddies that shimmered like mirrors. Shots cracked from unseen rifles. Radio static hissed. Men waited for ambushes that might never come. Nerves stretched thin until every rustle sounded like an attack. The jungle governed sleep, and sleep was another battlefield. In cities across America, students debated philosophy over coffee-chanting slogans painted on cardboard. In the jungle, soldiers debated survival over canned rations scraping mud from their boots. The two conversations, separated by oceans, were stitched together by fear and misunderstanding. And yet, beneath this labyrinth of confusion, one reality settled like fog. Victory required certainty, but the war offered only doubt. In a conflict where truth bent under pressure, the most dangerous enemy was not the one crouched behind a tree line. It was the creeping suspicion that no one really knew what they were doing at all. Far from the glare of television cameras and briefing rooms, a secret artery pulsed through the mountains and jungles. It was not a single road, but a labyrinth of footpaths, hidden rest camps, camouflaged storage depots, and rivers crossed under moonlight. The Americans called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To North Vietnam, it was a lifeline. It snaked through Laos and Cambodia, slipping beyond the reach of official borders. Trucks rumbled along its muddy veins at night headlights wrapped in cloth. Porters shouldered rice sacks up narrow switchbacks. Soldiers marched silently beneath dripping leaves. It was not elegant, but it was ingenious. Where bombs tore craters, bypasses bloomed overnight. Where planes dropped explosives, teams with shovels waited calmly in the dark. American commanders believed they could sever it. Waves of bombers hammered the mountains, detonating entire slopes into avalanches of debris. Forests were shredded into splinters. Napalm poured fire across valleys until the night glowed orange. Yet by dawn, porters walked again. Each crater became another hiding place. Each broken bridge was replaced by three more. It was not infrastructure. It was will. Behind this network stood the North's quiet brilliance. Logistics officers mapped the seasons, anticipating mud and monsoon. Doctors built jungle clinics underground. Engineers buried fuel tanks beneath waterfalls. Villagers served as lookouts, warning of aircraft long before they appeared overhead. The trail adapted like a living organism, and every American effort to kill it only made it evolve. Desperation bred innovation. Sensors were dropped from planes disguised as leaves, listening for footsteps. Computers at distant bases analyzed faint vibrations. Special forces slipped through vines' faces, painted green, searching for camps that vanished like ghosts. But the jungle was patient. It muffled the sensors, swallowed footprints, and hid the wounded beneath dripping canopies. Supplies moved in relentless rhythm. Rifles, ammunition, rice replacement uniforms, everything the war needed flowed south along this hidden spine. The trail became more than a route. It became strategy. Time itself marched with the porters. Each month that shipments continued, Hanoi gained strength while Washington lost confidence. American pilots returned frustrated, convinced they had hit nothing but empty jungle. Their bombs rang like fists beating water. Analysts back home counted tonnage dropped, insisting the trail must be severed. But the numbers were blind. The jungle was not. To the soldiers in the South, the trail was myth. It explained ambushes at dawn, sudden resupplies, enemy battalions appearing where none should have been. They cursed it in foxholes fired into tree lines and wondered how men could fight on so little food and so much determination. In Hanoi's command rooms, maps marked each improvement, each new bypass, each storage node. Generals smiled quietly. They watched the protests in Washington. They read reports of falling morale. They had studied not just warfare, but the American temperament. Bombs could kill trees. Doubt could kill nations. At night, porters whispered encouragement to each other beneath starlit leaves. They spoke of unity of land, of ancestors buried beneath the soil. Every step south was a thread pulling tighter around the invaders' resolve. Their endurance was not measured in battles won, but in years survived. For the United States, the trail was a frustration. For North Vietnam, it was destiny woven through foliage and fog. And for the villages along its hidden course, it was both salvation and curse, bringing rice to some airstrikes to others. The Ho Chi Minh Trail proved a truth as old as warfare itself. A supply line can be bombed, but a belief cannot. And beneath the endless canopy, belief marched on one quiet footstep at a time. On the eve of the Lunar New Year 1968, Vietnam seemed to pause. Traditions whispered through the streets, incense curling through doorways, families preparing meals, lanterns swaying softly in the night breeze. In Washington, officials spoke confidently of progress. North Vietnam, they insisted, stood on the brink of collapse. The war's end felt close, at least on paper. Then in the early hours, the silence broke. Across the length of South Vietnam, explosions tore open the dawn. Over 80 cities, towns, and military installations erupted simultaneously. Saigon's embassy compound was breached. Rockets fell on Hue. Firefights raged in alleyways where children had played the day before. Tet, the most sacred holiday, became a cacophony of gunfire. American and South Vietnamese troops scrambled to respond. They pushed the attackers back room by room, street by shattered street. In Hue, the battle raged for nearly a month. Rifle fire echoed through ancient courtyards and walls, once adorned with poetry, now bore bullet scars. Civilians hid beneath collapsed roofs, clutching family heirlooms and prayers. The smell of smoke hung in the air like memory. Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the North. Tens of thousands of combatants fell. Their ammunition stockpiles dwindled. Streets ran with their blood. And yet Hanoi had not gambled on victory in the field. They had gambled on perception. For weeks, television screens in America glowed with images of chaos. Reporters stood beside burning buildings. Soldiers spoke of shock. The contradiction was unbearable. Victory as near officials had promised. Then viewers watched guerrillas storming cities secured months prior. Trust cracked like glass. In living rooms across America, something subtle slipped the confidence that leaders spoke truth. Walter Cronkite, the nation's most trusted newsman, returned from Vietnam grim and weary. On air, he declared the war stalemated. To a public already doubting his words felt like gospel. In the White House, Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly murmured, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Protests surged. Draft cards burned in plazas. Mothers marched alongside sons. And at night, campuses glowed with candlelight vigils and anger. The credibility gap widened into a chasm. Meanwhile, in the jungles, American platoons pushed forward, clearing house after house, only to withdraw days later. Hue's ancient citadel fell in ruins. The city's temples echoed with quiet grief. Soldiers searched basements, finding civilians who had survived on tears and hope. Tet exposed a harsh truth dominance on the battlefield meant nothing if the public lost faith. Television did not show strategic maps or casualty ratios. It showed bodies in streets, fear in eyes, and smoke rising from neighborhoods once considered safe. In Hanoi, generals smiled faintly. They had spent lives to purchase perception, and perception was priceless. In Washington, advisors argued in hushed tones. Some urged escalation, more troops, more bombs, more fire. Others whispered that the war's heart had already stopped beating. For the United States, Tet was not a military defeat. It was a psychological fracture. In a conflict where victory depended on belief, the mirror had shattered, and no amount of firepower could piece together its reflection. When the smoke of Tet began to clear the damage it left behind, was measured less in ruined buildings and more in broken trust. For years, Washington had promised progress. Generals briefed reporters with confident smiles. Charts pointed upward, arrows arched toward victory. But the images broadcast into American homes told another story entirely. The contradiction gnawed at the nation's conscience. Parents who once hung Blue Star banners in their windows now questioned what those stars meant. College students already uneasy with the draft grew louder. Newsrooms sharpened their tone. Official optimism became a phrase murmured with disbelief. And in conversations whispered across dinner tables, a quiet question took shape. Were we being told the truth? The Pentagon Papers arrived like a thunderclap. Leaked documents revealed years of miscalculations, hidden doubts, and rosy reports written to soothe, not inform. Strategies that made sense on podiums dissolved under scrutiny. Decisions justified publicly as necessity were privately described as political calculations. Belief the oxygen of democracy thinned dangerously. Television amplified the fracture. Reporters embedded near the front lines filmed ambushes and uncertainty capturing the raw exhaustion on soldiers' faces. Veterans returned home with haunted eyes, speaking of villages where victory felt impossibly distant. Their testimonies clashed with official statements, and the gap between the two widened into an abyss. Politicians tried to bridge it with speeches. They spoke of dominoes falling across Southeast Asia, of America's role as guardian of commitments too sacred to abandon. But the public had changed. The draft drew sons from small towns and crowded cities alike. Each casualty report carved another wound into the national psyche. Flags folded into triangles appeared in living rooms where disbelief had once bloomed. In the streets, protests swelled. Marchers locked arms beneath banners, voices rising like waves. Police met them with batons and tear gas. The nation watched itself unravel on television, and every clash deepened the fracture. Campuses became battlegrounds of ideology. Families split along generational lines. At the heart of it all, a simple, devastating question echoed, why? Meanwhile, in Vietnam's paddies and highlands, soldiers felt the shift. Letters from home spoke of anger and confusion. Newspapers arrived with headlines that weighed heavier than ammunition. Some wondered if their sacrifice still mattered. Morale eroded quietly like wood left in the rain. Orders were executed, patrols continued, but doubt crawled into foxholes and never left. Inside the White House, advisors debated furiously. Each option carried cost: escalate and inflame protest, withdraw and risk humiliation. The war that had once seemed distant now pressed on every decision, every election, every whisper in the halls of power. For the first time, leaders began to count not just casualties, but disbelief. Foreign observers watched closely. Allies wondered if America's resolve had limits. Rivals took notes. They saw that a superpower could be wounded not by defeat on the battlefield, but by division at home. In Hanoi, generals understood this perfectly. They watched television clips of protests with quiet satisfaction. They had spent little to purchase so much doubt. Trust so easily spoken of, so fragile, became the true casualty of Tet. The credibility gap was no longer a metaphor. It was a chasm stretching from jungles half a world away to living rooms glowing with static light. And through that gap, belief in victory, belief in purpose, began to fall. Wars can survive losses of territory, treasure, and time. But once they lose the faith of those who fight and fund them, their foundations crumble grain by grain. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, the war he inherited was bleeding not just lives, but legitimacy. The streets outside echoed with chants, campuses simmered with unrest, and the political cost of every fallen soldier grew heavier. Nixon promised something new, a plan to end American involvement without admitting defeat. He called it Vietnamization. The idea sounded simple on paper: withdraw U.S. troops while training and equipping South Vietnamese forces to stand alone. It promised dignity, strategy, and time. Advisors spoke of strengthening morale in Saigon, modernizing armies, and handing the battlefield back to those who lived upon it. The president's speeches reassured families watching at home. Reinforcements would no longer be boys from Ohio and California, but soldiers born beneath the jungle canopy. Behind the language of policy, there was calculation. Reducing American casualties meant reducing protests. Lowering the presence on television meant lowering public outrage. Vietnamization was not merely a military doctrine, it was political triage. And for many, it offered hope. In training camps across South Vietnam, instructors drilled recruits in Western tactics. Uniforms were issued, rifles distributed, officers groomed. Helicopters roared overhead, ferrying advisors to lecture halls where chalkboards described enemy maneuvers. From a distance, it looked like an army rising. Up close, cracks spread quickly. Corruption gnawed through supply chains. Fuel disappeared from depots. Weapons intended for frontline units surfaced on black markets. Rural soldiers returned home to find their families taxed heavily. Villages intimidated by militias, loyalty shifting under threat. The same fragility that plagued the government flowed through its ranks. Nixon sought leverage elsewhere. Secret orders sent bombers into Cambodia and Laos, pounding suspected sanctuaries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Explosions lit jungles that had never heard English words. Maps were redrawn in darkness. Officials denied what villagers watched from rooftops, fire falling from foreign skies. The secrecy deepened the wound in public trust. At home, television screens flickered with violence not from distant jungles, but from American streets. National Guardsmen faced students. Tear gas billowed across campuses. Kent State left bodies on a campus lawn, their textbooks soaked in blood. The war had crossed oceans and borders, invading domestic life in ways no administration could contain. In Vietnam, the gradual withdrawal created strange rhythms. Units boarded helicopters one day and abandoned bases the next. The terrain they once patrolled became gray zones claimed by daylight, lost by night. Villagers watched uniforms change, but not the fear. For every checkpoint established another collapse somewhere else. South Vietnamese troops now at the front fought bravely in many places, but their morale was tethered to a fragile state. They lacked the air support artillery and logistics that had once thundered behind American advances. When the U.S. stepped back, the jungle crept forward. In Hanoi, leaders studied every withdrawal announcement. They measured resolve by the number of boots boarding planes. Patience had become their sharpest blade. Time was their ally. When the U.S. sent fewer soldiers, the North sent more whispers cadres, promising land justice, independence. Belief once again outmaneuvered firepower. Yet Nixon achieved something generals could not. The war began to fade from the front pages. America's attention shifted inward to scandal, to social upheaval, to disillusionment. Each returning soldier found fewer parades and more silence. The war that once defined an era now clung like smoke to a nation eager to breathe clean air. Vietnamization was not failure in one stroke. It frayed slowly, thread by thread. It handed rifles to men whose government could not guarantee wages, food, or trust. It asked villages to choose loyalty in a world where loyalties vanished with the sunset. In the corridors of power, the plan looked neat. On the ground, it was brittle. Wars often end not when objectives are achieved, but when the effort to sustain them becomes heavier than any nation is willing to bear. By the early 1970s, the war's heartbeat slowed. One by one, American combat units boarded transport planes and helicopters, their boots leaving muddy prints on tarmac before lifting into the humid air. Families watched their sons return, thinner and quieter eyes, shadowed by things they would never fully explain. Flags greeted them at airports, but applause could not silence the questions that echoed behind their stares. On paper, Vietnamization continued. Advisors remained. Equipment flowed to South Vietnamese units. Speeches assured the public that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam could stand on its own. But beneath the surface, something vital had fractured. Corruption hollowed supply networks. Officers traded favors like currency. Soldiers fought bravely in some battles and vanished from others, pulled home by fear, hunger, or doubt. In the countryside, the Viet Cong persisted. They moved like whispers through rice paddies, collecting taxes, enforcing discipline, promising justice where the state offered only forms and fines. Each village they touched shifted slightly, like a compass needle nudged by an unseen magnet. The war was no longer measured in territory, but in allegiance. Global politics pressed down like a storm front. Détente eased Cold War tensions between superpowers. America's focus drifted to scandals back home, first rumors, then investigations, then headlines that reshaped the nation's trust in government. Protest signs faded from weather, but anger lingered. The war became a ghost that haunted every conversation and election. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords declared what diplomats called peace with honor. Paper bore signatures, photo flashes captured forced smiles and promises echoed across the world. American troops would depart. Prisoners of war would return. But in the jungles and highlands, rifles remained loaded. The ink dried faster than the blood. As the last American combat soldiers stepped onto transport aircraft, they left behind allies whose fate was sealed quietly. Helicopter rotors thumped farewell, and the sound slowly faded into the sky. In Washington, applause greeted the end. In Saigon, silence greeted uncertainty. For 2 years, the conflict smoldered. South Vietnamese divisions, deprived of American air support and ammunition, stretched thin across long frontiers. Morale cracked. Commanders argued. Defenses buckled. In the North, Hanoi waited for the moment when political will in the United States fell lower than the monsoon clouds. When the offensive came in 1975, it was not a slow push. It was a flood. Provinces collapsed in days, not months. Roads clogged with refugees, families clutching bundles, children barefoot, elders pulled on carts. Tanks rolled through boulevards where markets once bustled. Helicopters scrambled from rooftops, rotors beating chaos into the air. Embassy gates bowed against desperate crowds. On television, the war returned for a final act. Civilians clinging to aircraft skids, smoke rising from evacuation zones, soldiers tearing patches from their uniforms to avoid retribution. The city trembled under the weight of history and resignation. Saigon fell not with cheers of conquest, but with the quiet surrender of exhaustion. When the last helicopters banked toward the sea, Americans watched from couches and kitchen counters. Silence stretched across living rooms. No speeches could soften the images. A war that began with promises ended in evacuation, messy, hurried, heartbreaking. For those left behind, the aftermath arrived swiftly. New flags rose. Old allegiances dissolved. Files marked collaborator became death sentences. Boats fled into treacherous waters, laden with families chasing slivers of hope. The war's echoes drifted into refugee camps, into diaspora communities, into stories whispered to children decades later. In the United States, politicians spoke of lessons. Veterans tried to rebuild lives in a nation eager to forget. Memorials began as sketches on paper, eventually carved into black granite, that reflected the faces of those who stood before it. Wars do not end when treaties are signed. They end when memory can bear their weight. And in Vietnam's humid air and America's quiet suburbs, the weight lingered long after the last helicopter disappeared over the horizon. When the guns finally fell silent, the cost of the war did not. Its echoes seeped into the soil, the skyline, and the human heart. Across Southeast Asia, fields once green with rice lay cratered and scorched. Bomb casings rusted beside broken plows. Entire forests stood stripped and skeletal, their branches twisted by chemicals meant to expose hiding places. The land bore scars as deep as the people. In Vietnam, reunification brought not relief, but hardship. Cities strained under waves of refugees. Re-education camps filled with former officers. Bureaucrats, anyone tainted by association with the fallen South. Families whispered carefully, their voices shaped by fear that walls had learned to listen. Hunger gnawed at villages isolated by ruined infrastructure. The wounds of war turned inward. The countryside struggled to feed itself. Tools had been weapons. Young hands had been soldiers. Fields detonated beneath feet that had once run barefoot as children. Unexploded ordnance slept beneath soil, waiting to wake at the pressure of a farmer's step. Every harvest carried risk. In Laos and Cambodia, the firestorm spread beyond borders, never meant to contain it. Bombs fell on jungles where no front line existed. Villages vanished from maps. And in Cambodia, the destabilization opened the gates to terror. The Khmer Rouge seized the moment, and the cost was genocide, measured in skulls stacked like monuments to madness. Across the Pacific, American veterans returned to parades that never materialized. They stepped onto sidewalks wearing uniforms that drew stares, not gratitude. Some were spat upon. Others passed through airports like ghosts. They carried shame they had not earned, questions they could not answer, and nightmares they could not escape. War had followed them home, silent and persistent. In quiet suburbs, marriages frayed. Children learned to avoid the sudden rage in their father's eyes, a reflex born from ambushes in jungles far away. Doctors struggled to name what infected these men. Shell shock, they said. Anxiety. Only later would a new acronym emerge, PTSD, to label the invisible shrapnel lodged in their minds. The economy felt the war's weight as well. Billions spent overseas fueled inflation at home. Factories shuttered. Trust in government eroded. Young Americans grew cynical, unable to reconcile patriotic myths with televised realities. The country entered a long period of introspection, questioning everything it once declared sacred. For policymakers, Vietnam became a dark mirror. They studied its lessons in think tanks and war colleges. They etched doctrines about intervention, about limited war, about the dangers of belief untested by evidence. Yet as decades passed, those lessons faded like ink left in sunlight. Asia transformed slowly. Vietnam opened markets, built factories, and educated generations born after the last helicopter fled Saigon's roof. Children grew tall beneath the shadows of monuments carved to fathers they would never meet. The nation moved forward, but memory traveled alongside it like a silent companion. In America, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial took form, not in marble triumph, but in black granite that swallowed light. Names were carved into the stone letter by letter, each polished surface reflecting the face of whoever stood before it. Visitors reached out and traced names with trembling fingers, whispering apologies decades too late. Time dulled the noise, but sharpened the clarity. Historians re-examined strategies. Soldiers wrote memoirs. Protesters aged into grandparents telling stories to grandchildren who listened wide-eyed, unable to imagine a nation so divided it could fracture along college lawns. Those who survived learned a simple truth. War does not end when the shooting stops. It continues in nightmares, in empty chairs, at dinner tables, in landscapes that refuse to bloom as they once did. For Vietnam, the war became a chapter, painful, defining, but not final. For America, it became a haunting reminder that power without clarity is a spear held by the blade. In the years that followed the fall of Saigon, both nations walked forward with shadows behind them. The Vietnam War became a living parable, interpreted and reinterpreted by generals, presidents, activists, and scholars. Each sought meaning in the noise, clarity, and the chaos. Yet the lessons refused to settle into a single shape. For the United States, the war fractured something fundamental: trust. It taught a generation to question official statements, to doubt confident promises delivered over microphones. The phrase credibility gap lingered like smoke, reminding citizens that governments can become trapped by their own narratives. When optimism becomes doctrine, truth becomes casualty. In military academies, instructors spoke of Vietnam with measured tones. They described the dangers of attrition, the futility of fighting an enemy whose home was the battlefield, whose patience was endless, whose cause was existential. They warned against metrics that counted bodies but ignored hearts. And they repeated a bitter truth: firepower cannot burn belief. Diplomats studied the war's diplomatic fallout. They saw how alliances strained, how global perception shifted, how rivals learned to exploit division televised nightly. They traced the arc from unquestioned authority to public skepticism, recognizing that in a democracy, foreign policy ends where public tolerance breaks. In Vietnam, the legacy took another form. Monuments rose in Hanoi, testaments to sacrifice. Veterans limped through markets, scars hidden beneath rolled sleeves. Families placed incense beneath framed portraits, honoring sons who never returned. They spoke of resistance, perseverance, and unity against overwhelming odds. Yet beneath pride lay quiet sorrow. The cost of victory is never free. Generations born after the war grew up amid its remnants. Bomb craters filled with rainwater. Fields still yielded rusted metal fragments. In Laos and Cambodia, farmers unearthed unexploded bombs like artifacts of a mythology written in fire. The landscape taught its own history, indifferent to textbooks. For American veterans, the memorial wall offered a place where silence could speak. They traveled from distant towns, touched the cold granite, and found their own reflections staring back. Names carved in chronological order transformed time into stone. It was not a monument to triumph, but to truth, the truth that every war ends in grief. Historians debated responsibility. Some blamed politicians unwilling to listen. Others blamed strategies built on flawed assumptions. Still others argued that the war was lost before it began, when policy mistook nationalism for communism, ideology for identity. The debates continue not because answers are elusive, but because memory is fragile. In movies, books, and classrooms, the war became symbol and caution. It warned against arrogance cloaked in noble intention. It cautioned that technology cannot replace understanding. And it whispered another lesson, softer but sharper: never fight a war the public does not believe in. Decades later, former enemies shook hands. Flags fluttered above embassies. Markets bustled with goods stamped made in Vietnam. Tourists wandered tunnels once carved for battle. Cooperation replaced combat. Time did what bullets could not, it healed. And yet every healing leaves scars. The jungle regrew around rusted tank hulls. Children played where artillery once thundered. But beneath the green canopy, roots twisted through soil enriched with memory. In the end, the Vietnam War revealed a paradox. A superpower can win every battle and still lose a war. A nation fighting for its home can endure losses unimaginable. And sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in conquest, but in the survival of identity. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, an aging soldier stands quietly. His hand rests on a name carved in stone, reflected in the polished surface beside his own face. On the other side of the world in Hanoi, an old man lights incense, bowing before a portrait of a comrade lost long ago. Two lives, opposite sides, bound forever by a war neither truly chose. And as dusk settles over both cities, their memories stretch long across the earth, like shadows cast by monuments that refuse to forget.